Welcome back to the podcast with me, your host, Pete Tigers. Where is the year gone? Rich and I are already working on the September issue of the mag, and I hope as this season drifts away that it doesn't end in a whimper. I'm certainly not going to let it do so. Anyway, on to my guest. He was born close to saltwater and has never really left it, especially when it comes to fishing. His work takes him around the world, and there is always a rod in his suitcase. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Neville Broad. Neville, it's great to have you along, buddy. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm good, Pete. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
You're most welcome, and listeners won't see this, but it looks like that's a fishing den that you're recording this from. There's pictures of fish, there's photographs, there's striped bass on there, there's all sorts of stuff. Is that where the magic happens?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely, it's the place where I do my fly tying sometimes whenever I get time to do it, or, wherever I'm trying to write articles, or even think about, the next place I'm going to go fishing. Certainly for this, it's been, the past couple of days, it's been trying to recall what I've done, through my fishing career. So it's actually been interesting. There's so many things I've forgotten that I've done, or, people that I've met that have influenced me that have, it's taken up a lot of my time. It's been really enjoyable.
That's wonderful to hear. And for listeners, can you tell us if you've been fishing and how the fishing's been?
So the fishing up until yesterday, locally, certainly where I live, which is Sittingbourne area, has been terrific for mullet. This season, there's been, again where I live, there's been so many finlet mullet about. It's just been, for me, for the visual side of fishing quite close in with a fly rod, it's been superb. It's been one of the best years. I had some good bass fishing the other night, which was great. I do prefer bass over anything else in the UK at the moment, and that's been good. But yesterday took a turn for the worse. We had a strong easterly wind, which totally kicks up the mud where I live locally, and the weed magically reappeared. So it was a curse. I had a couple of casts and then basically come home. So yesterday was a bit of a disaster, but most of the time I've been catching some really good fish this year, so it's been great.
With the weather that we've been having, your visits to the beach, does that mean that you're seeing a few more anglers around?
Not so much where I fish. It's kind of like it's a really, really long walk, so that puts off a lot of people, but it's good for me because I need the exercise. Certainly, as you go around the coast, you see more and more anglers. We tend to see a lot of lure anglers. And me and Steve Richards, who's a great friend of mine, we we still tend to be the only, sometimes the only fly anglers that are there. But as you go further down the coast, certainly towards Chichester, for obvious reasons, you see a lot more fly fishermen, and rightly so. It's a great place to fish.
And I saw you at the Orvis event as well at Hayling Island. That sort of gave us a snapshot into the UK saltwater fishing world pretty well, didn't it? It was really well attended. I'm told over 200 people over the weekend.
Yeah, it's just got bigger and bigger, hasn't it? It's an amazing thing because as you discussed with the vet recently, it brings together all sorts of abilities of people. There's loads of people willing to help out, and there's loads of free, well, not free, but there's demos and stuff like that. But I think from a beginner's point of view, got to do a shout out to Orvis. They do free 101, beginners lessons and casting and things like that, which are really, really essential. But the Orvis Saltwater Festival. Again, I was researching that again, and I was heavily involved in the beginnings of that. Was the inaugural one was in 2020 when I think I guided with Phil Spratt and others on that, and I guided on the first beginners one as well, and that they were really good. Obviously, there was less people, but it was really exciting, and you could see the potential of obviously the festival where it was held around Hayling Island and Chichester, and it really started to grow and grow from those beginnings. There was a previous one, a precursor to that, in St Maur's. I was heavily involved in the St Maur's festivals in 2019, and Orvis decided to take it, more locally to Chichester the year after in 2020. So that's where it all started. But yeah, it's massive, and you can tell from the likes of Pete Kurtzer from the States coming over and just being amazed about how great it is. So you can tell it's something special when you've got great anglers such as him coming over and just lauding it and saying how good it is. So yeah, it's from a social point of view, you just can't beat it.
Yeah, the social aspect was pretty cool, wasn't it? The ability to hang out and talk. And I barely fished, I've got to say. I've written a piece that'll be in the mag in a couple of months' time about it. And I barely fished because it was just nice talking with people, catching up with people. And one of the questions I wanted to ask was, you said that you help with the beginners. And I'm interested to understand, because I suspect the beginners aren't, by and large, all beginning fly anglers. But for when you're guiding people and taking them out, is it interesting for you to see people who may come from a trout fishing background or a grayling fishing or salmon, to see when that light switches on and they get what you've been enjoying for a number of years?
Yeah, I think so. I only did it that first year of the inaugural festival, but I did really enjoy it. And I was coaching, for want of a better word, people from all disciplines, even people that didn't know how to cast. So, you would have kind of preferred that maybe they would have tried to do a one-on-one lesson before, but that's not always practically possible, typically because of distances to travel to get to them. But yeah, you're exactly right. I think when people catch their first bass, typically on the fly, they the light switches on and you realize, oh my god, this is something special. Even if it's a really small fish, it doesn't matter. It's just totally wild. I don't know, there's so many different ways to catch it as well, in so many different situations, and possibilities are endless. But also, certainly from the freshwater point of view, they can realize that they can go in the summer when fisheries are closed and so on and so forth. So even now in this really, really hot summer, you can go out and catch bass and mullet and other species as well, and it takes you through the year. It's really good.
Nice. We're going to go on to perhaps some fishing tips and stuff like that, but I'd like to explore your fishing timeline a little bit. Where did fishing begin for you?
So I was around about 8 years old, and my brother was banging on about he'd gone to a local canal on the Isle of Sheppey and was fishing for eels with like garden worms or whatever it was, and I tagged along with one of my friends, and he caught an eel, and I just thought, oh my god, this is amazing. And it really started from there. So on from that. During that time, which was mid-70s maybe, the thing to catch in the winter was flounders. We had thousands of flounders around, certainly around the northeastern side of the island in those days, before they built car parks on waste ground and stuff like that. And you could basically just flick out a ragworm and be confident you catch a flounder. Because obviously I couldn't drive in and stuff like that, I hagged my dad so much to take me every weekend. He must have been so fed up, because I could tell he didn't really like fishing, but he took the time to take me fishing, and he'd have a rod as well, and I absolutely loved it. So that really got me into it, and it was. I think the thing was, it was an easy fish, relatively easy fish to catch. So you know what it's like when you're trying to teach kids how to fish. They really, really want to catch fish, don't they? So if they go home and they blanked, I think it's probably harder to get them back into fishing. That's just the way things go. And then what happened after that was, obviously there were far more tackle shops in those days, and there were really, really a social side of fishing as well. You'd get together and you'd listen to people's stories and stuff like that. And one of them was, there was a guy who came in and said, "Oh, I've just lost I've just lost a massive bass. It broke my snap swivel, and I thought, oh, that sounds interesting. That sounds like an amazing fish to fish for. But actually, probably in likelihood, he'd probably lost a smoothhound, probably more than the bass. But he might have been right. And I just thought, that's the fish I really need to get into. So yeah, I started more of an obsession, even on the bait fishing side in those days, on trying to find out where bass were being caught. So we had a really, really good spot. Well, a couple of good spots on the island. One was Garrison Point, again, which is on the northeast end. And I spent a lot of my school holidays with my friends fishing for bass. And yeah, everything took off from there, really. Certainly from the bass point of view. Yeah, so that's kind of like where I started. I also got into competition fishing in those days, saltwater. There's a club called the Sheppey Crusaders. I think they might still be going. But within that, they did have a couple of England internationals, one of whom was Des Savoury, who's still a great friend of mine, terrific rod builder. But he brought me on, and they were kind enough to take us down the coast to fish competitions. And yeah, I think I won one year. We were catching pollock, we were catching mackerel, pouting, all sorts of different species that we wouldn't get back home. So that was really, really exciting. I used to love those days going down the coast as well. So that really expanded my saltwater horizon. So yeah, those were certainly the early beginnings. They didn't involve fly fishing in those days. But I then saw, I think it was a video one of my friends lent me from a guy called Ed Schlifka, and it was called Rock Hopping, and I think it was Rock Hopping for Bass. And that was around about 2000, 2005, 2006 maybe. And it was the first time I'd seen someone caught a bass on lure, and he was using the Rapala J13. And again, I just became obsessed with lure fishing for bass. Obviously, we didn't have to pay for bait. Bait was becoming more and more expensive, or it was more difficult to dig because a lot of the grounds were being dug out locally. And yeah, I got a fixed ball reel, a lure rod, and a couple of J13s, and I caught my first bass on a lure. In Sheerness, which is back of Tesco's, which is crazy. But yeah, that really got me into that. And then I was kind of all set on lure fishing for probably the next 5 or 6 years. So much so that I was watching things from America, the likes of Kevin Van Dam, who was an expert pro. He's now retired, and just realizing there's so many different ways to fish for bass. In so many different scenarios, you can use plastic worms, you can drop shot, you can drag a worm along at 0.1 mile an hour, which is, I don't know, a bit tedious. But at the end of the day, there's so many different ways to fish for them in so many different situations. That's what I love about them.
It's interesting what you said there about you became obsessed by things. And is that how you've learned and got good at it? That when you go for something, you target in on it, and that's that. And so you're really focused on it. And is that how your fishing sort of evolves in that sense?
Yeah, I think so. I take it to, I wouldn't say an extreme, but a point where I become proficient at trying to catch a certain species. It's definitely been the case with bass over the years, and more recently with mullet. But there's been other scenarios that we're going to talk about where I've been fortunate enough to fish abroad, certainly with my job, and then fish for other tremendous species. So certainly in terms of the UK, for me it's bass and mullet that are the kings at the moment. So yeah.
Also, very, very interesting was where you talked about the tackle shop as a hub, and we're still seeing examples of that in the UK, but also your learning curve that you could learn from local people and people that you got to know, and then, of course, you discovered videos and things like that. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because the world now, that we're kind of doing the same thing, but on a global level, aren't we? With social media and the way you can reach and interact with people really, really easily.
Yeah, you can you can find out anything now. It's just everything's within reach. Um, it's a bit more difficult to try and research things that are older, obviously, where the internet wasn't around in those days. But I think certainly for the past 20 years, you can find out whatever you want. You can. I think one of the amazing things is watching the fly tying videos. So if I want to try and tie a fly, I'm not a great fly tyer, but I can tie good enough to catch fish with it. I could, turn on my computer, go to a certain person or expert, and just follow along, tying a fly, which is actually the way I like doing it. So, whether it was Lefty Cray's old videos or whoever, they're available. They're on the internet, and that's a massive thing for me. There's definitely more and more videos or clips available now of people fishing all disciplines for various species and stuff like that. People like on social media, on Instagram, if you look at the likes of Hector Rodriguez, he does some great clips on how he fishes for mullet. Same with Fly Fishing Londoner, and more people are doing it. So that's really good. So everything's definitely more accessible now. And then of course you've got Andy Ford's summaries of the Orvis Festival, which are really useful as well. I think people can pick up and get enthusiastic by that. They can also see people catching fish and how they're doing it as well, which is really good.
So for me, I'm interested to understand, where did the fly rod come into all of this for you?
So I think it was around about 2009. There was a Trout and Salmon magazine that had a cover. I must have seen it in a newsagent, and it had a guy fishing for bass in Cork. The guy's name was John Hall, and there was, to have a cover featuring those that were in any days for trout and salmon on the saltwater fish is pretty incredible. But as it was a bass, I picked it up and I looked at it, and then I went to the article, and it had all the flies in there. It had, these guys climbing down ropes, down cliffs to in their enthusiasm to get on the rocks and fly cast to bass, and they were catching, some great fish, 6-7 pound bass, and I just thought, oh, this is amazing. so I did what. I think I bought the same tackle that they were using. Probably a Sierra rod at that time, Sierra rod and reel. Probably some basic floating and intermediate line, and then typically I would try and buy the flies. I think I probably bought a couple of deceivers, a couple of clousers, and the usual kind of stuff. But yeah, that article really infused me. And then eventually you get to realise there's more and more people doing it. So yeah, and like you said, you will bump in. It's inevitable. You're going to bump into another fly fisherman, and whatever they've learned is going to rub off on you. So I do tend to, when I'm fishing with someone, try and sit down and watch them fish for about 15 minutes, half an hour, just to literally observe what they're doing and trying to improve myself in doing that. So yeah, that's where it all took off for me with bass, because I was already fascinated, as I've mentioned before, by the bait fishing and my lure angling. To try and catch one on a fly rod for me is still the ultimate. It is a challenge, and it's fantastic when you achieve it.
And what's really interesting for me is that you've sort of come into the sharp end of fly casting as well, haven't you? Because you're probably fishing 7-8 weight rod at that time.
Yeah.
Not having picked one up before, you probably got to learn to double haul as well. How was that process for you? How did you learn to cast a fly for the first time?
So I did join a trout fishery. It was called Milan Waters, which I think is still going in Iwade, near where I live. I forgot to mention this. I probably should have done in terms of a timeline, which was just probably a year or two before I started bass fishing, and I used to really love fishing a team of 3 buzzers on a drift. under an indicator, which would have been probably a small piece of egg yarn or something like that. In April, May, it used to be fantastic. I used to do mainly catch and release. We could keep a couple, but I don't really like eating trout, certainly the ones from there. But I used to release everything I caught when I could. And again, there was a guy there. I can't remember his surname, but he was called Phil. And he taught me to improve my fishing, and taught me about the importance of not always going for distance, but obviously observing what's around you, fishing the edges and things like that. So all of these things kind of add up, and they're totally relevant to any environment, whether it's freshwater or saltwater. So that was really, really good. So I would probably be using a 9'6", 6 or 7 weight rod back then, obviously with quite a long leader team of flies, and that definitely improved. And years later, I think that stood me in good stead for mullet, because we're fishing them in similar ways, certainly up here where we are. So that was all really good.
And I guess that time, 2009, I don't know if it's the first coming, second coming, third coming, things were starting to happen then. You say on the cover of the magazine, that saying about a bass on the front cover now is red rag to a bull to me now as well. So watch out. But it was really getting going, because there were other magazines around at the time, weren't there? And there was Austin talking about, getting the mullet up with maggots, and I think we touched on that with Yvette. There were other stuff there. I was working for Nick, and I first met him when we were bass fishing. There was all of these sorts of things quietly happening in the background, and that's the difference, isn't it? That it was sort of fed through magazines, so it was reaching lots of people in that way. And it sort of has always been there, but I think it's probably things like the festival, isn't it, that have really sort of continued to keep it in people's minds to make it of great interest to them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, if we talk about social media, even things like WhatsApp. So the festival's got its own WhatsApp group around it, and it's got a huge membership, and people giving each other tips and advice within that. So even things like that have really helped. I don't know, Pete. There's probably been a drop off in the amount of take up of magazines over the past 10 years because of social media, but obviously social media, as you said, has picked that up, and is educating people along the way. But I still think ultimately, as a fisherman, whether it be a fly fisherman or whatever, you got to fish with someone who's competent in catching whatever it is you want to fish for. I think that is the main thing. I think you can go so far on your own, but you've got to be fishing with some. I've been really fortunate. I've got some great influences in my I've had in my life, and still lucky enough to call my friends. So Darren Jackson, just an incredible angler, off the scale. You could go fishing with him and you'd have one fish and he'd have 10, and he'd been swapping over flies, thinking about the next area he's going to move to, tactically just insanely good. So Steve Richards, again, massive influence on open coast fishing, particularly for bass. He's won so many flipping Orvis festivals, but again he's kind enough to show me how he fishes and the techniques he employs. So fortunately, meeting people like this and having time to spend with them has really improved certainly my fishing.
So what we haven't covered is that first fish on the fly, that first bass on the fly. Talk us through it.
So I would have probably it would have been on the Isle of Sheppey, definitely. I would have put out probably a half decent cast, and then all of a sudden things went solid, and there's still times when you think, hold on, have I hit the bottom, and then the bottom starts moving, or a piece of weed. But it was exactly like that. It was a solid take. It's interesting with bass because the takes can vary so much. Remember, they're sucking in the volume of water, and your fly is among that. So the takes can be so different. But that one went solid, and then it started moving, and it wasn't a particularly big fish. It was probably about a pound or something, but we had a pretty good fight, um, and I brought it into the shore, and it was like, oh my God, it's such a beautiful fish, and yeah, the feeling was just, as you can imagine, amazing. And to be quite honest, every time I catch one now, it's the same feeling. I just love them. Um, they can be really, really aggressive. If you catch them in shallow water, a decent fish will kick up a stink and sometimes take you down to the back in. But as I said, there's so many different ways to fish for them. So I think the ultimate way is what I learned in France with an expert called his name is John Baptiste Vidal. He's put out some brilliant videos, and he can put a crab pattern on a sixpence. It was fascinating fishing with him because a lot of the time with bass, same with mullet, they're so close in, and people would kind of they want to wade in and cast as far as they can, and they don't realise a lot of the time they're literally putting the fish off that they've just either walked in front of or beside. So I think that's one massive learning is, when you start off your casting, do it from the shore, do it from almost as far away as you can, and then work your way along, fan casting or whatever. But just bear in mind that bass can be really, really very close in. So in the estuaries, particularly the Odette estuary in France, I'd meet him and then we'd go out there and he'd say, okay, well, there's a bass. There's a bass. There's this. Oh yeah, yeah. And you realise how close in they are. So he does fish a long leader. Amazingly, he uses 8-pound fluorocarbon as his tippet, which I still can't believe, and he's sometimes, landing double figure fish on that. But what amazes me is his casting ability. He's just incredible. He's just, he'll put it in front of the bass. He won't land it on top of its head and spook it, or he'll put it on a piece of, seaweed bladder rack and then just move it or just trickle it off it to tempt the bass. And it was just fascinating. And I managed to catch a couple of fish, and I definitely improved my game through that. But it's just, oh my God, I was in the presence of a true expert. And unsurprisingly, he's great at catching permit and stuff like this, and sight fishing on the flats and stuff. But again, I was so pleased that I did that. We even spent time. He showed me how he ties his crab patterns, so that was great as well. But it's just another way of catching bass, and certainly a lot of people don't. A lot of people just doing cast and strip, which is fine in the right situation, but never forget that you can, if you take your time and get to the right places, you will see bass. And you don't want to spook them, and then with the right setup, and the right fly, you can definitely catch them.
Interesting what you say there as well, because many of us, I think, would probably think that we'd be pulling a clouser or whatever it may be. But you mentioned crab there, crab patterns. How are you fishing a crab pattern then? Is it a very slow figure of eight? Is it drawing it similar to if you were fishing for permit, for example? But there might be people listening who do saltwater fishing who have not tried a crab pattern before, and some advice would be really cool.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly in the south of England and in France, and maybe, I don't know, a lot of places in Europe, you just want to get as accurate a cast as possible. You don't want to spook the fish first and foremost. A lot of the time, it's working out the trajectory of where the fish is moving to as well. And you don't have to move the crab. So in the first instance, you would hope that the fish would see the crab. Okay, and I don't know, 7 times out of 10, the bass would come in, he'd put his tail up, and he'd literally suck in that crab. So you would hopefully see that and then know when to set the hook. Other times when it appears they might not be interested is when you do want to twitch it slightly, but it's certainly not stripping. If you go to the States, there are a lot of times when you do a slow strip when you're fishing crab patterns, because a lot of the time the visual aspect of there is probably a longer cast, and then drawing the fish onto the crab. But again, it's kind of slow. It could be very, very long, slow strips and then a pause. in those situations. But certainly, when I was fishing in France, it is kind of all about the accuracy of where the crab goes more than anything else. The other thing is with crabs is a lot of the time you don't want them too heavy, because again, you don't want that kind of splosh scenario where you're just going to spook the bass that you've just taken, I don't know, 30 minutes to find or whatever, which is not a good situation. But if you get an accurate casting, a lot of the time they'll find it, and they'll take it. Particularly it seems to be particularly in the summer, when they want to conserve their energy. They don't want to be, chasing fast strip flies and fast moving bait fish. They want to conserve their energy, and they want an easy meal. So, as I said, a lot of the time the bass will be very close in. Go out and have a look for them in your local area. I think you might be surprised.
It's raised a couple more questions for me. One of them is that you talk about sighted fish, but perhaps people might be in a situation where they're not spotting fish so easily. So would you throw at nervous water, for example, if you saw that? Would you throw your crab pattern towards that if you're not seeing the fish clearly?
Yeah, I would do, but I would be also in the back of my mind, I would be thinking, well, are these mullet or are these bass? So I think the answer is yes, but I think it's a speculative thing more than again being more accurate. I've learned to make sure that I take mullet flies as well as bass flies for those situations. But I do really think you can see the bass a lot of the time. You'll see that kind of black back image. They tend to move, in my experience, a bit more slower than mullet in those areas. So I don't know. I mean, yes, there are times when it won't be the right fish, but you can certainly narrow down your odds.
And what about then with the crab pattern? If it's flat and it's left there,
Yeah.
and the fish picks it up, is there any signals that you'll see that allows you to know? And do you wait a little bit? What is the situation? Because you said it's obviously sucking in water. And how would you know with a static fly? What are your indicators?
So if the situations are perfect and you can actually see the fish, what will happen is its gills will flare, and a lot of the time they'll actually kind of go at an angle, like a permit does when they take a fly, and they'll suck it. That, as you said, you want to give it a little bit of time. You don't want to strike too fast, but you'll kind of know. Now, if you can't see that, you want to go by your line as close to the tippet as you can see, and then go by that movement. That's really all you can do. But I would say wait a little bit longer, and I think that's a pretty good rule for bass fishing on the fly anyway. I think a lot of the time when people are striking too fast, they are moving the fly out of the mouth of the fish that's sucking in that volume of water. A lot of consensus from experts I speak to in America is like kind of feel that the fly's in there and then set the hook. That seems to be a popular opinion. Or when the fish has already moved off with the fly, then give it another strike, another pull to make sure the hook's set. And that's another thing. Just make sure your hooks are as sharp as needles as well on your fly. So particularly if you're going to use a fly that's already been used, maybe something from last year that's hopefully not rusted and been kept well, but just make sure that it's really sharp.
Some great tips there. That's lovely to drill down on some of that. That may open up bass fishing. I'm thinking where I go, generally, it's quite hard to see them. So that's why I was sort of putting myself in that situation. But for you, go on.
Yeah, so the classic kind of place would be bladderwrack, kind of rocks on bladderwrack on rocks, interspersed with either mud or sand or whatever. And obviously a volume of water. So, typically, if you think about, so for example, Hayling Island or Chichester, for example, very popular areas, a lot of the time you'll have that. And then when the water comes up higher towards high tide, you'll have enough of a volume of water over those rocks and that weed, and you will definitely see bass. You'll definitely see bass. And the the hardest problem is when you're on top of those walls and stuff, looking down on it, is not to spook it by your casting. So maybe practice doing like a sidearm cast. Sometimes you'll even need a bow and arrow, which is what John was expert at. I witnessed him literally bow and arrow to a fish like he was stalking a massive stocked trout, and again the accuracy was everything. But yeah, just take a walk along those areas. It does tend to be on the flood, but you can get them on the ebb as well, as long as there's that volume and the clarity. Obviously, if it's been blowing a hoolie into that area, leave it a couple of days until it's settled out again. But my advice is go and have a walk, and I think a lot of the areas you don't realise they will be there. So it's worth looking at.
And what are your must-have flies for any bass angler or potential bass angler?
Yeah, so definitely a Clouds and minnow in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes you'll need ones that are quite well dressed, some that are literally thin with a couple of strands of bucktail to represent matchstick sand eels. Deceiver patterns, typically the ones that score for us down the coast will be size 2Os with typically chartreuse over white, or yellow over white. They score particularly well. Darker coloured deceivers for nighttime again along the open coast, mainly for that profile more than anything else. I know that. So, for example, obviously black, purple, or wine coloured can really score well. We haven't talked about surface, have we? So poppers, I love fishing poppers, particularly up estuaries, and this time of year is fantastic because a lot of the bass are on these finger mullet, these small size mullet that are just been the first year class, and they just smash them. So a nice popper, something that's not too big, manageable from a casting perspective. Again, probably an 8-weight rod. Would weight forward line, something like a Rio Outbound, to get it out there, and then use as long a leader as you can. One thing I did learn when I was fishing with Vito in Italy, in the lagoons in Tuscany or Batello, was that if we did use a short leader and the bass would get suspect or spooked by the fly line. So he did come up with a method where he's just using as long a leader and as thin a leader as he can on the surface. A guy called Giovanni De Pace ties these amazing poppers, and again, that helped definitely increase the catch rate. They're just things of beauty. They're easy to cast. They stay high in the water, and they create a lot of movement and a lot of noise. They kind of go side by side like a good lure does, and the bass are just fascinated by these. So we've had some really, really good sport on that. And then the take on a popper is fantastic. So you definitely need some poppers. What else? Well, depending where you're fishing, a lot of mullet flies do work for them, particularly around estuaries and stuff like that. So worm patterns, either drifted or static. There's times of year when bass are feeding hard on shrimp. So again, shrimp patterns would be really, really advisable. And again, you can double up and use some of them for mullet. To be honest, the list is endless. And then you've got things like flat wings, which were invented by Kenny Abrams. He's just an amazing guy, still alive. And the great thing about flat wings is the whole idea is they're sparse, and the saying is just add water, which is literally the amount of movement that you see from these flies, particularly in the current, because you want to try and fish them on a swing in the current. It is amazing. So it's minimal materials, bucktail, a saddle hackle or two, and you'd look at it and think actually it can be a really basic fly, but so effective because of the movement and the sparsity. So that's a great way to fish, and you can fish them using the floating line, maybe a slightly longer rod, but you can grease line swing, you can wet fly swing, various different ways of fishing that fly in the right scenario.
Some great tips again there. And I don't know if you'd ever used it, but I know I don't fish for bass in quite the way that I used to, but I used to find pink over white fish
Yeah,
for Klausers. Have you found that?
yeah, definitely. I really, really like fishing pink as a general colour when the water's a bit more stained, a bit more muddy. For some reason, I don't know whether whether the fish see it better or whatever, whether it's a confidence thing with me. But pink is definitely a colour that's worked really well for me, as you say, particularly on my local estuary when the water's muddying up a bit. And another colour combo that's really good when the water's dirty, I found, is orange over black, or even black over orange. That seems to work really well as well. So yeah, but you're definitely right. I think probably with me it's more of a confidence thing than anything else, and a recollection that I've caught something on that before. But yeah, there've been seasons when I've just more or less used pink and and bagged up on bass, but it was the right place, the right situation at the right time more than anything else, I think.
One of the other things you mentioned was long leaders. And
Yeah.
for context for listeners, can you let us know what you mean by a long leader?
Yeah, so the average setup leader would be probably something like a tapered leader to, typically for bass down to 16 pound line. I did mention that the guys in France are using 8 pound tippet and stuff like that. So it really depends on the situation, and obviously you want to go thinner and lighter if the water's clearer and there's a chance you might be spooking the fish. So 9 foot, in other words, a rod length would be typical, and that's generally the go-to that I use. But that will change. We've already mentioned before, certainly with the top water and sometimes with crabs, you might want an extended leader. So that might be up to, say, 14 feet if you can manage that. I would just say slow down the cast. Think about using more medium action rods, which is definitely what I'm using more lately. Just slowing down the cast. Um, what was the other thing? Sorry, I'm lost. No, sorry. What I also wanted to say was it's just important when you're using the sinking line to reduce that length, because if you think about it, if you're using the sinking line, what you don't want is the fly to be rising up. That defeats the whole point of using the sinking line. So there are times when I'll use the sinking line, particularly locally when the current is really raging in. I might use a sink six even. Um, Again with a medium fast rod, and I'd probably use maybe 4 feet of leader in that scenario. 4 feet of straight through 16 or 20 pound leader in that scenario, and that's perfect because I know that I'm getting in that case usually a Klauser minnow on the bottom, which is where I want it, and I'm either almost jigging it along the bottom to entice a bass to take it.
Well, that's a whole load of tips there for people to get stuck into as well. So thank you so much for those. I wanted to move on a little bit. And I said in the introduction that work takes you around the world and takes you
hmm
abroad. Can you tell us when you're abroad then, does that mean you're instantly looking up, right, are there any fishing that I could perhaps do?
Yeah, definitely. I'll try and do some homework on where it is that I'm going to be going to, or it might be a case that it might be an extra flight or whatever to get to a place that I've either fished before or is reachable on a cheaper domestic flight. I do kick myself because certainly in the early days when I used to travel to Chicago quite a lot. I wish I'd done more of it. I didn't tend to do it in my earlier days, but now it's if I can bolt on the weekend either side, I'll definitely do it and make the most of it. Um, but I am fortunate in that I've done so many places around the world fishing. It's just I'm so lucky. It's just amazing.
What are the highlights?
Well, the biggest one was obviously during COVID. Um, straight after the first lockdown, I remember I booked up a trip with Johnny of Wild Fishing Pursuits, Wild Guided Pursuits, sorry, Johnny Stevenson, who'd been telling me about the chance of catching a halibut on the fly in Norway. And obviously I thought, no, come on, you must be joking. They're too deep and all this kind of stuff. And he actually made me realise that some of the fjords out there in the Arctic can be really, really shallow. So, I mean, relatively speaking, so let's say you're fishing up to a depth of, say, I don't know, 30 metres, but typically maybe 15 metres. And the halibut are chasing, a lot of the time, these large sound eel launts. So it's perfectly feasible to try and catch them on the fly. And I remember that time I had to do. It's always 2 flights to get there. So to get to, I think it was Tromsø that I had to ultimately reach. That year, I only went for a weekend, which is crazy, really. But because of COVID, things were getting messed up. So I remember I flew into Copenhagen and had to do a COVID test. But they were so amazing there. It took maybe 15 minutes in total, and then I was off and I was on the next flight to Tromsø. Picked up a hire car and then drove to where Johnny's at. And literally in the first couple of hours, we were catching cod on the fly. So the setups were, and still are, 12 weight rods, sinking lines. So typically what we'd use is maybe a 450 or a 550 grain depth charge line, and then probably attached to the end of that we'd have something like a T17 or T14 tungsten Rio on the end of that, and then obviously your large flies like pike streamers. Again, funnily enough, I caught it on a pink streamer, but yeah, I think after 3 hours, I saw this. I put out a good double haul cast, which we do on the boat. So typically, what you'd have, just from a safety point of view, Johnny might be lure fishing, and I'd have a fly rod out, and vice versa, just to make sure we weren't tangling into each other and stuff like that. But put out a good cast, and then I saw this big white kite coming up to take the fly about 20 yards as I was stripping it back towards the boat, and it was a halibut. And I said to Johnny, I said, "That's halibut." And the next thing, all hell broke loose, and it took the fly down, and it took us here, there, and everywhere, and it was just amazing. There was a pole that was coming that it took us round. We had to kind of navigate that. So luckily we were in a boat. But yeah, I think after about 30 minutes we got it up to the top, and we've got this on video. Johnny's got it on video from his mobile phone, and the first thing he said when it came up, he said, that's a world record halibut. It's like, but the thing is, we were using 30-pound tippets, so we couldn't claim IGFA. But anyway, it's a Norwegian record, so it turned out it was 100. I've got the certificate up there. It's 164.5 centimeters, which is a Norwegian record. And that was literally the first morning I got there. How insane is that? It was just it was something else. It's like, it still is like a dream, when I get asked about it. And we managed to get it to shore. We managed to photograph it for evidence, and then Johnny managed to release it. That was the most wonderful thing about it. So again, there's video where he's releasing the halibut, and it follows the halibut swimming back out along the field. It's just, the whole thing's amazing. And to be fair, I've got him to thank for that. I've got a guy called Morton who did the video in, and also people. The whole setup was really, really well done. So yeah, that was pretty amazing, and still is. That's the most wonderful thing I've ever done in fly fishing.
That sounds extraordinary. And would it be fair to say then that the more unusual something is, the more it interests you?
Yeah, I think so. Funny enough, I was more interested in catching a cod on the fly. because cod have been, again, one of those species, when you go back to certainly my youth, we could catch them readily. So a lot of my winter was taken up bait fishing for cod down, locally and down the coast, and it would be fantastic. And unfortunately, they're just not there no more. They've been over commercialized, and maybe there's something to do with the sea temperatures there that hasn't helped either, but they're certainly not there. And yet you go to Norway and it's like, every second cast you can catch cod. So my interest was really about catching the cod on the fly, and we were using some quite large clousers to catch them, and it was fantastic. But then again, to catch halibut on the fly would be magic, and we managed to achieve it. I've had other halibut on the fly since then, but no, as you can imagine, nowhere near as big as that. I've had babies and things that were maybe, I don't know, a quarter of the size on the fly, but that guy is just, it's incredible. So, yeah.
Is there anywhere that you still haven't visited that you would like to visit?
Yes, probably somewhere like Exuma Flats for the permit out there. I'd love to have one shot at a GT before I disappear, wherever that might be, Seychelles or I don't know. But again, unfortunately, they seem to be cost prohibitive. Those, I know that people talked about, you could do it in Christmas Island, which is a bit more, apparently more cost effective. So maybe I might do that one day, if my health allows it. I think those are the two main things I'd like to do that's left. Maybe kingfish on the flats in New Zealand. That looks really good, but again, these are a long way away, and I don't like flying massive distances like that. But what you got to do, right? So, yeah.
I like your style. We've touched on tackle a little bit, and you've mentioned various rods. You've said medium fast, more medium action rods. Tell me what you have as a Hall of Fame piece of tackle. What rod and reel are your favourite ones that it would take a lot to prize out of your hands?
Well, my favourite is something I don't necessarily use locally, but certainly abroad, particularly when I'm fishing for striped bass in the States or Canada, is I've got a 10 weight Hardy Marksman Z that feels more like an 8 weight in your hands. It's a dream to cast. Again, I'd say it's, I'd describe it as medium fast. And then I've got Fortuna Regent 10,000 to match that, which is an unbelievably great reel. It's large, so when you call a line off of it, it comes out virtually straight, so there's no problems there. That's my that's the kind of set of tackle that I'd probably never sell. But the other thing is I've got various rods. I've definitely got too many. Just ask my wife; she'll tell you. But some of the cheaper rods that I've got. So, for example, my go-to for mullet is an A Jensen Mekiss. You can still get it on eBay, and they're around about £110, and that is closer to certainly a medium action rod. Definitely want to slow down the cast when I'm mullet fishing with a team of up to 3 flies, and so I don't have necessarily expensive gear. I definitely have gear that tends to last. On my fly reels, apart from that Hardy, I've got old Orvis reels. I've got a lot of match catch reels, which really do stand the test of time, and again they're relatively cheap. So I'm pretty good in terms of lines. I really like for bass. I really like the Rio Striper, particularly the intermediate. It's a really nice line to cast. And it's also clear on the weight forward end. It's like a clear line, so I don't know whether that makes a difference, but it's certainly again a confidence thing when you're fishing it particularly in the daytime when the water's clear. if I'm casting the popper, I probably use the 9 weight or the 8 weight. When I'm fishing for mullet, I tend to use the 6 weight. And again, so things for mullet is where I'm casting a lot of time, and I am putting the line on mud. That's one of the things I was taught by the wonderful Josh Allen, who come up with the indicator method for us locally. Great guy, and also Hector's advanced that, so hats off to him. But one of the things that you got to do with mullet is, if you don't want to fall 4 feet into mud and virtually kill yourself, is you got to decide whether you're going to use really, really old gear and not worry whether it gets muddied up, and that's what we do. So sometimes we'll cast across the mud. A lot of the line, particularly the running line, will be laying on the mud. And then what you want to do is, as you're playing the fish, get it to a place where you can land the fish. So typically kind of a rocky area where the water's there and you can net the fish. So don't be put off by casting an old line onto mud. I know it sounds really weird and it's not great for the fly line, but you can wash it off when you finish. Or what you can also do is, in between casts, is you can do your normal cast out to sea and then get most of the mud off that way. So, one kind of forced cast out to the sea to clean it, and then back onto the mud for the mullet. And that, I started doing that about 3 years ago, and geez, with the indicator method, my catch rate just skyrocketed.
That's wonderful to hear. Well, thank you for some more tips there as well. We're coming up an hour now, so we're going to start to wind things up. But here's the tricky question for you. You've answered everything else absolutely fantastically and beautifully. But what about if you're driving down from Sittingbourne, I know it a little bit, down to the coast, heading down that way, and you're going fishing? What's the music that you put on the car to set the tone for that session of fishing?
Well, probably be a band called Gel, which I'm in. I play drums. A song called Sing Something Simple, which I'm really proud of. It's a great song. So it'd probably be that. And for a longer journey, it would be All the Blinding Menace LP, which again is freely available on download or whatever. But it would be that. But if it wasn't that, oh my God, I'm into so many different bands. It's just, music's been, along with fishing, a huge part of my life. Mainly thanks to my brother, who got me into the Beach Boys when I was about 6 years old. It was still one of my favourite bands. Punk, two-tone, the Jam. I don't know. There's so many great bands. It's just crazy. I've met Liam Gallagher twice, and he is a really, really nice bloke. I met him first when they were doing their first tour in Tunbridge Wells, and then I met him at Gatwick Airport in the pub, which is no surprise. And I also met Thom Yorke from Radiohead, again on their first tour in Canterbury University when they were supporting Frank and Waters. And one of the things he said to me was, I said, well, this was obviously after their gig. I said, well, what's going on? What's happening with the group? He said, well, we're going to be the biggest group in the world. And the amount of times different people had said that to me, and I was just thinking, oh yeah, all right, yeah, of course. And it turned out to be true, didn't it? So there you go.
Perfect. Tell us about your band. What style of music is it?
It's all our own original music. I would describe it as kind of, I don't know, indie pop, heavily influenced by all sorts of various bands. But Andy Gray's our songwriter and singer. He's just got a wonderful voice, and his lyrics are, pretty original. I don't know, so many different influences on REM, the Jam, all the really, really good stuff. So, yeah, Wings, Beatles, ABBA, whatever. So many different influences. So hopefully that comes out in the music.
Nice. Well, I'm going to go and have a listen to that afterwards. And if people want to contact you, because I'm sure you're going to get loads of questions after this. So how do they find you, Neville?
So probably the easiest way is Instagram. So it's at Nev Broad, SWFF. I'm also on LinkedIn, Neville Broad PhD. And obviously I'm on Facebook as well, just as Neville Broad. So any of those ways, really. yeah, love to talk about fishing. That would be great. I'm always willing to give any experiences I've got, or try and put you onto the right person if you're far away.
That sounds fantastic. Well, I'd like to say a huge thank you for being a guest on the podcast today. I've been fascinated listening to your story and your expertise as well, which is shining through, and it's getting me thinking about things as well. So I'd like to say a huge thank you for being a guest on the podcast today, buddy.
Thanks, Pete. Appreciate the opportunity. Take care.
Well, everybody, this has been another episode of the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed this as much as me. As ever, there's never going to be any charge for these. It's just nice talking about fishing. There'll be plenty more coming very, very soon. But thank you so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Fly Culture podcast, brought to you in association with the Voice of Game Angling, Trout and Salmon, where Pete is the editor.